Greetings and welcome to another episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. I'm your host, Scott, and Caleb, as always, is with me here tonight. Caleb, how you doing?
Doing great.
That was convincing. Say, we're back again to talk about the experience growing up as youth group kids in the 90s and how that has shaped our adult lives. We'll talk to old friends about their faith journeys spanning from the 90s to today and discuss current cultural topics through the lens of someone who grew up in that era. Now, Caleb, we're in week 2 of our little politics mini-series. We don't have a guest. It's just going to be you and I today. And so hopefully, listeners, if you have not listened to our first politics episode, which was last week, please go back and do that. Otherwise, this is kind of all about where we're at today and why, as opposed to last week. So, Caleb, kind of summarize what we talked about last week.
Hi, this is Caleb, the producer of the show, just breaking in like I do every episode to remind everyone that the views and opinions expressed on this show may not actually be held or even approved of by everyone appearing on this episode. One of the goals of this show is to give everyone a safe space to share their opinions and thoughts on deeply personal matters of faith. We are not looking to start an argument, but instead let people share how they feel. We also know that our memories of events that happened 25 to 30 years ago may not be 100% accurate. We assume everyone's best intentions as they share how they remembered the experience of their youth. Now, back to the show. Yeah, last week was revealing. We both brought out our entire voting records and we threw those out there. I made fun of you for voting for this person. No, that's not what we did.
You edited that part out.
Probably. If neither of us could vote for Jesse Ventura, both of us missed that opportunity, so we're both absolved from that one.
I'm pretty sure I actually did vote for that guy.
Oh, see, this is why we're doing this, people.
I'm pretty sure I did.
Shame.
Those commercials were hilarious.
Was I out of? Oh, it's a whole other thing. All right. So, yeah, we started the conversation about politics. And we are well aware this is hot button topic stuff and can get a little touchy, but we just were kind of trying to examine what we thought the influence of politics were on our youth group experience, but also what other things we recognized and a little bit about our story, kind of leading up through some of that. We kind of talked about some family of origin stuff. Stuff that came up was like one issue voting. We definitely talked about abortion and homosexuality and kind of even the emphasis on family values, kind of some of those things that were there and kind of how they impacted. I felt like it was not just youth group, but also kind of some home life stuff as well. So that was kind of where we're at from part 1. Did I miss anything?
No, not really. I would say that you and I can both agree that finally we can agree on something, that our church growing up was not ultra political.
Yeah.
We may have dodged a bullet that way, and I think we talked about maybe it's because we lived in Minnesota, who knows, but at the end of the day, we didn't get a lot of politics from the pulpit.
Yeah.
It was much more subversive, whatever the right word is. That we talked about it maybe on the sidelines a little bit or in certain studies, but none of the head pastors or preachers really that I remember got super political.
Yep. It didn't even feel like it was in church settings. Very often for me, it felt like there was some, but a lot of times it was more in the outside of church settings where it seemed to be more discussed or those sorts of things came up. And I think I remember hearing one issue voting, again, kind of with a youth leader, but not in a youth group setting.
Right. Yep. That's all we need to do was vote our conscience on one issue, and we've kind of, clean your hands, done your job kind of thing.
Yeah.
That was 25, 30 years ago. Long time. And a lot has changed. So interested to just kind of ask you, what's changed for you? Like how have you matured or changed in this area?
I don't actually know how much I have changed. There's definitely been a journey, and I would argue, I guess I wouldn't argue because I don't think anybody's fighting me on this. I would say that I feel like a lot of my adult Christian life has been characterized by feeling a step or two off with the majority of people I go to church with when it comes to politics. Because again, like we talked about in the first episode, I was raised by two ex-hippies and who voted Democrat because my mom was in education and my dad was married to my mom. No, he also was a liberal who I think he would vote conservative occasionally, but that was my family of origin. And so I picked up on a lot of those things. And so I have always been much more moderate than many of the people I went to church with. And I can remember a number of specific examples where I was either called out on it, made fun of about it, or downright in the last 10 years, and we'll get to maybe this, but questioned what if I was even a Christian because of my non-Republican voting habits. And I'm pretty moderate. I've been pretty moderate my whole adult life. I was not answering the question at all. That's how it's. So I don't think it's changed a ton. I think it's just been an ongoing progression from my family of origin, and just kind of how I see it has changed. And I've had moments of anger around it more than I had when I was younger. That's probably the biggest thing that's potentially changed, is some of the angry outbursts from myself to myself.
You gotten more angry?
Well, I said this on another episode that isn't out yet. 2020 was a bad year for my anger. I've had to sit down with all four of my children and my wife and just say, I'm sorry for being so angry, not at them, but at other things. So yeah, no, it's I've gotten more angry at times, and I'm trying really hard. It's been a real struggle for me to not be so angry, because yeah, I'm a pretty pissed off dude. I'm a pissed off pacifist. I'm a huge walking contradiction.
This is a very interesting tangent we just took.
I know, well, I'm so sorry.
Fortunately for you, the topic of politics is pretty chill, so this will be fine.
Exactly.
But I'm a little curious on your end, and maybe you'll speak about this later, but we just mentioned Five Oaks wasn't a super political church from the pulpit. You did go, though, to what we both agree is a conservative church.
Yes.
And probably 2010s-ish. Like, did you get it there a lot, like straight up from the pulpit, or was it way over the top, or was it, again, more in the group setting?
You cut me off at any point if this gets too out of hand. I was at Bethlehem Baptist, which is John Piper's church, from 2004, I want to say, through 2017. I think that's right.
Oh, I didn't know it was that long.
It was. I met my wife at Bethlehem, and all four of my children were born while we attended Bethlehem. So yeah, it was a long time at Bethlehem. I will say this, I'm thankful for my time at Bethlehem. It was a very formative part of my faith, and there are still things about my faith that I am thankful for my time at Bethlehem. I think of the the churches the two of us have attended, I win the most conservative church award
for sure.
by far.
For sure.
It was never from the pulpit, and it really wasn't. Their caveat, it was never who you should vote for from the pulpit. But yes, every year there was a sanctity of life sermon that they would do, and they would kind of have a week around abortion stuff and sanctity of life. And so that was very clearly pushed. And I know post when we've gone, Piper has gotten into some politics stuff, but I'll tell you a story of, I remember a congregational meeting. It was coming up on an election, and I don't remember the election. And there was a member who came up and said there was kind of an open question, open forum, and he was pushing for the idea that Bethlehem should actually be more political. And he's like, look, we've got these family voter guides that tell people the right way to vote.
Oh.
Why isn't Bethlehem pushing these from the pulpit? John, why aren't you telling people how to vote? And Piper stood up, and to his credit said, that's totally inappropriate to do that from the pulpit. He just said, no, I will not do that. Now, I'm sure there are a number of people who would say that he has still probably said too much. That's maybe fair. I'm not going to argue against that, but that, to his credit, I think he did say, I just don't believe that's what I'm called to do at all, is to tell people how to vote. Now, outside of the pulpit, he said a number of political things. But so yes, it was a very, very, very conservative church, but it never was from the pulpit that like go out and vote for this person or this person. It was definitely abortion is bad. That was preached from the pulpit.
So it was tacit encouragement to vote for a certain party, but it wasn't outright, George W. Bush, vote for him. Or John McCain, I suppose, during that time.
Yeah, and it was not even vote against abortion. It was just, this is why we believe abortion is evil.
Mm-hmm.
It was not even the notion of voting the right way was not mentioned. So again, feels a little more subversive. It wasn't like you need to vote this way. We've let's lay out why abortion is evil, and then let's go vote the right people in.
Vote on those morals.
It was yes, it was more just like abortion is evil, and here are things you can do to help. We're going to do a prayer walk. You join the prayer walk at the Capitol, or get involved in these pregnancy resource centers, those sorts of things. I don't even know if the topic of voting to outlaw abortion ever came up from the pulpit that I remember, and I could totally be wrong, because I think that would have bugged me as a person who is not conservative. That would have frustrated me, and I think I would have remembered that explicit call to vote a certain way.
Sure. Well, if you would allow me to dovetail that story with mine.
Yeah.
My wife and I lived away for a few years. We moved back in 2016, and we're looking for a church to attend. And we decided, after a few months of church shopping, that we would go to Grace Church in Eden Prairie. And Grace is a mega church, sits about 4,000 or 5,000 people. They have concerts there. It's huge. And just, not my style. We lasted there 1 year, and there were two reasons we lasted there 1 year. And it was mainly because almost every time I'd come away being like, all right, the pastor used alliteration more than any other pastor I'd ever. It was insane. It was like, to make a point, every word has to start with the same letter. Ugh. But more than that, two things happened. One, they were going through the book of, I believe it was 1 Corinthians, verse by verse, like most churches do. They came to the chapter, I'm sorry I did not look this up before, but they came to the chapter of slavery. And there's a verse that it's a chapter break, but of course original scripture doesn't have chapter breaks, so that was where the original interpreters put one. And then so verse 1 of like chapter 6, I'll put it in the show notes, said something about slaves obeying your masters. And they ended 1 week at the end of chapter 5, and they started the next week on chapter 6, verse 2. They completely intentionally skipped a difficult verse. And then what really put me over the top was, it was November 2016, or maybe October or September, something like that. And the pastor gets up there, and he said, now, I don't normally tell people how to vote. I just want to tell you what our values at Grace are. And he held up a finger and he said, the number one value this year is Supreme Court justices. And that got a standing ovation that lasted more than like 30 seconds. And I was like, I'm out of here. And look, obviously that has played a humongous role in the issue of abortion that we just talked about. I get it. Right, evangelicals, you feel like you won. But that was so inappropriate to me, and it just made me realize how much idolization there is in this whole thing. Supreme Court justices being a big idol. Like that was exactly that message. These people will save us. These people will save our country. So that was my experience of it coming from the pulpit, and I couldn't look back quickly enough. I was like, I'm out of here. So then we started going to a smaller church in Minneapolis that is, to be honest, even though it's certainly, I think I've said in the past, it's more evangelical than it's not. It certainly does a very good job of not telling people what to do and arguing from both sides of the aisle.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, my current church did a sermon on abortion, I don't know, a year and a half. We haven't been there that long. And he straight up said, like, there are people who are pro-life who vote Democrat because they believe that the best way to reduce abortions is the Democratic approach. And he got a ton of hate from it. Our pastor got like
I'm sure he did.
endless emails that because he was promoting this idea that I think we all agree like nobody wants more abortions. We want less.
Correct.
But it's okay if people come to different consensuses on how that can be achieved. Yeah. And I know he got tons of hate for that.
Well, it's an interesting comment because statistically that has been true. Mm-hmm. Although moving forward, who knows? But up to this point, statistically that is true. Now, given that fact, is it actually then more about having less abortions, or is it more of a political moral victory? Because that's a super complicated issue. Mm-hmm. Super, super duper complicated. And so we're not here to answer those questions or divulge into that. Although we've spent a lot of time already.
Yeah, I know.
Yikes. But it's more complicated than just saying yes or no.
Yeah.
And so when it becomes an issue of a huge ultimatum as to abortions can't happen whatsoever in any case, you start getting laws about women's medication and that sort of stuff. And that's been such a maybe a through line from our first episode to this one is that was the one issue.
Yep.
And it was portrayed so simply back in the 90s.
Yep.
Right? You're just a baby killer. Don't do that. Mm-hmm. All right. Now, a lot of people understand it's way more complicated than that. Women's health is an important facet of this conversation, and the percentages of fetuses and whatever, it's way more complicated to understand. So is it just about A, having a moral victory, and B, that was, we mentioned this last week, the purchase price for their vote to win. Yeah. That's absolutely it. And at the end of the day, is it actually a win or not? That was the big thing for me is the Supreme Court justices are idols. And I didn't want to be in part of that conversation.
Yeah, for sure. When I feel like you've been on more of a journey potentially than I have, because I probably have moved less. And again, that family of origin thing. Do you feel like that's an accurate statement about kind of your journey through some of this?
Absolutely. I mentioned last week that my family is conservative, and I've gone the opposite direction. We'll talk about a few of these talking points with somebody who's a generation younger than us, and I think that episode's going to come out probably mid-August. But that was an interesting part of that conversation with our guest about how they view politics, especially in light of 2016. I was kind of identified with some of that change that he went through. At any rate, yes, I said in that episode that's coming out, in the future, I'm sure a lot of people believe I went to a liberal arts college. I got a degree from that college, and a lot of people are just convinced, oh, that's why he's a liberal now. Yeah. That's absolutely not the case. I'll tell you a quick story about college. I was a leader in IVF, and this is not something I'm proud of, but I'm going to tell it. It was Pride Day or something. I don't know what it was, but people who were in the group for LGBTQ people went around in the evening, the night of, and wrote, not really offensive, it wasn't vulgar, but they just wrote supportive messages in chalk on the sidewalk. And one of them was the Apostle Paul was gay. And you look into that, and you have the thorn in your side versus all that kind of stuff, and there's no real indication one way or the other. Right? There's no. It's a pretty big stretch.
We're going to solve that on this podcast. Let me tell. No, let's not solve that on this podcast.
Oh, you're way more prepared than me. But
I am not at all.
But I got so mad about that that I wrote an anonymous note, and I wouldn't call it like hate mail or anything, but I was so mad. Like I wasn't man enough though to go talk to somebody. I just wrote an anonymous note being like, "You're wrong, and here's why." And I put it in their mailbox, because back in the day they had mailboxes. Who knows if they have it now? And that's where I was in college, in my liberal arts college. I came out there. I took a year, and then I went to seminary, and that's really where it hit home for me. And that's really where things started to change. And look, for all intents and purposes, Bethel Seminary is pretty, would be considered conservative. It's not a liberty, thank God, but like it's not, some, liberal progressive place either. And so part of the start of that was drilling down and understanding biblical ethics really start with putting yourself before somebody else, giving up of yourself to help the other, considering yourself less than somebody else. And when you start to think about how that plays out politically, that doesn't really play well into our system, right? Yeah. Now, look, people are very generous and there's ways to help people out, but a political system, how it operates functionally for the city and community, that's pretty difficult to do if all of your ethos is, hey, we're just going to help out the little guy, right? You got to have growth, you got to have strong economy, all that kind of stuff. But ethically, there's not a lot of emphasis for like you be comfortable yourself first and then you can help out somebody else.
Yeah.
That was kind of a start. And then, I think my very first class was church history class, and I think rightfully so. Most seminaries do that. You start to look back and like every single time church and politics come together and there's an amalgamation of the two for leadership purposes, it always fails. Always. And that's because the saying power corrupts and it corrupts absolutely is 100% true.
Yeah.
So you look back at church history, there is no real successful combination of the two. And we'll get maybe into that in the end of like where we go now. But, Christian nationalism is a thing at the moment. And hopefully it's not for very much longer, but like that's a real thing. And that was a real thing in some pretty terrible and legitimately horribly destructive governments.
Yeah.
So we got to be really careful about that combination and how does it look. And so when I see that playing out right now of we have to combine the two, and you got a Michael Flynn saying that this is a Christian nation first, that sort of thing. It's what, like no, that's not what anybody was taught or how it actually went down. But also too that the combination of the two resulting in power is pretty antithetical to what Christ calls us to do. Again, if you are supposed to lay yourself down, wanting power, influence, and authority, all of which Christ gave up, is not an ethic a government should operate on.
One of the concepts that I've always struggled with is that Jesus's teachings are like turn the other cheek. If somebody takes your tunic, you give them your smock. That's not right. Some other garment of clothing. But
I want that translation.
It's like Caleb's an idiot translation. But those sorts of things, like those are meant to drive our lives, right? And like that's how I truly, like, I've made the joke about being a pacifist a couple times, but like I truly am because of those verses. But some of those things don't translate to how you should run a nation. I don't believe a nation can always just turn the other cheek. I don't know if that's actually a good policy. And so that's always been one of those things that's broken down this idea of Christian law, Christian rule, or Christian governing, because I feel like it doesn't always work at that level. Like Jesus's teachings may not be the best way to run a nation. And so that's always kind of been troubling to me. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, you're actually making sense for once. I would say when Satan has Jesus on the hill and says, I will give you control over this entire world, all you have to do is bow down to me. What does he do? He rejects him, right? Yes, the answer is it can't. A successful nation can't function on those ethics of passivity, peace, and ultimate sacrifice. My point is, those are by far the overarching ethics of Scripture. By far. And so, can you get other ethics and apply them? Absolutely. But that should be your ultimate lens. And at the end, I'll kind of talk about, maybe people are listening and be like, well, if you're not against abortion, then aren't you just letting babies die and you should be for them? They're the, most innocent of all of us. We can talk about that. But yeah, I mean, my point is the main ethics of Scripture shouldn't be introduced into politics. That's not what they're for. Now, it doesn't mean you can't influence and you can't, point culture or help point government in a certain direction or not. But it shouldn't be your absolute definition of how to run things, because it just can't function that way. So I think you actually have it pretty right, And a lot of what we're tempted to do these days, especially because you get so much of the cross, I'm a Christian, I vote this way. And then you also get the influence, and we said this last week, of angertainment. Remember that good word I definitely stole from someone else? Like, a lot of people these days on both sides feel like they need to uphold this nation or it's going to fall apart. If something happens, it's going to fall apart, right? But at the end of the day, maybe a Christian's perspective should be whatever happens, it's going to be fine. Maybe I won't be as comfortable. And that's another thing, is a lot of this is a lot of the craving of power is a craving for comfort. Okay. It's a craving of, I need to be comfortable. Otherwise my faith I can't live out my faith how I want to. And so we see that in a lot of other places who have kind of outright rejected, in Europe. Yeah, they have outright rejected Christianity to a large degree. It functions, it's still there. It's just in a different format.
Yeah.
So I would say your trepidation about those ethics being applied is well-founded. They shouldn't be.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Did that answer your question at all?
No, that's good. I mean, I feel like, again, like, back to your seminary experience, like you're definitely the one who has looked into this a lot more. And I just, like all of my musical takes, it ends up being a lot more on feel than anything else. Like, this is kind of how I feel about it. And so, like, you talk about those ideas of power and like how that corrupts people. And like, we've seen that so much in the church, but I feel like we've also seen that we've seen that, right? So many pastors who are powerful, they get their money from church, they fall. And you're almost the odds are at least point stacked against you that there isn't some scandal coming if you're a pastor who has led a church for 30 years and has gotten kind of to be a bit of a celebrity. Like, there's almost a scandal coming. That's a whole other thing. But like, what are the other places that do you feel like that's something that also has impacted kind of how the church views and interacts with politics, is just that idea of, like, I don't know.
That's actually an excellent segue. So, you have the religious right, you have the party of family values in the 80s, kind of reacting to what happened in the 60s. And a lot of what that is grounded in is this whole, rise of power for white men, or at least the trying to cling to power for white men. And there are two books that bookend this experience for me. Okay. I don't have a copy, thank God. I actually don't even think I ever owned a copy. But did you ever own a copy of Wild at Heart?
No.
Come on.
No, I didn't. I have a whole story about it, and I'm not going to get into it now, but I did. And to the point of me and a guy, like, really disagreeing. Like, I joke about being a pacifist, but like, I really, really struggled with that book.
Did you actually fight him?
No, that was the joke, though. That was the thing, is he was like, when my boys get home and if they've been bullied, I'm going to tell them to go sock the bully. And I was just like, I don't think that's what Jesus taught. I don't care how wild the heart man. And like, we had like this huge like falling out because of that book, because he was so sold on that book. So yeah, I never owned it though.
Fair enough. So Wild at Heart sold like 4 million copies, which is a lot for a book. And, it was extremely popular, right? Yeah. Most of our listeners probably understand this. John Eldridge. I read that book and I was immediately like, no thanks. And so like this part of it goes into my personality. I am rather passive and I am a peacemaker. Okay.
Sure.
So that I have to understand that that's part of it. But the whole like Go back, if you have that book on your shelf, go back and look at that book and count how many Bible verses are in there. It's very few. Most of what John Eldridge draws his masculinity and Christ from are movie heroes. William Wallace and Braveheart. How many times did you sit through a William Wallace sermon? Like, I know I could, it was more than one or two for me. And this whole idea of like, men's retreats and all this kind of stuff, like, heck, dude, I just saw something on Twitter about like some men's retreat going on. It's basically like military basic training. Like, dude, no, I don't, that doesn't resonate with me in terms of who Jesus was. And so what I understood about that book is there's a very militaristic understanding of who Jesus is. And it goes back to a lot of understanding about what's parts of Revelation and the lion or the lamb mentality. A lot of men are way more comfortable with Jesus as the lion than they are with him as the lamb. And I would challenge every people who might think that way to say, look at what Jesus did. He's much more of a lamb. Maybe he comes back, whatever. That's not for us to decide. So anyway, you got Wild at Heart on one end, teaching you all this tough guy machismo. You gotta, you're in a fight. So that means you have an enemy, and you're going to have to, fight through with that enemy, much like a bully situation. And then the other side, you have Jesus and John Wayne, which I cannot recommend to anybody, to everybody here. Please go read that book. It is.
So you can recommend it. You cannot recommend it
enough.
Yeah.
What did I say?
You said you cannot recommend it.
Oh, no,
I cannot add that enough.
I cannot recommend Wild at Heart, but please go read Jesus and John Wayne. It is a researched, very well thought out, here's what happened, during the Teddy Roosevelt era, that kind of thing. And Jesus and the John Wayne era, when Billy Graham became really popular because they needed somebody on TV, but they identified John Wayne, who was absolutely not a Christian, as like this purveyor of Christian values, which is, I'm going to fight and I'm going to be aggressive and I don't care what you think and I got to be tough, right? And that, I don't know about you, but like we went on a couple, I know I went to Promise Keepers with you one time.
Yep.
And a bunch of older dudes, and like that, the men's retreat stuff, just, you can't get me to go to it because it's all, I mean, maybe it's changed, so maybe I'm not giving enough credit, but I cannot sit through any more like, you gotta be, the most masculine version of yourself possible. That doesn't say Jesus to me.
Yeah.
Because it's, you have to defend what you have, and Jesus never did that.
Yeah, Jesus at his most lion are after he's the lamb. Like, yeah, he kills sin and death after he lays his life down. Like,
and it's for the purpose of somebody else.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, look, we're recording on Memorial Day. We need to give a shout out to everybody, of course, who served, which would be Veterans Day, but also the tremendous sacrifice that people make in the military to bring us the freedom to say these things without somebody knocking on my door and dragging me away. And the freedom to disagree with one another. That is all extremely important, and I will never take any of that for granted. That being said, like, again, a part of what you're talking about before, like, how does Jesus's mentality of turn the other cheek fit into that? It's very difficult. It's not an easy, like, just vote for this party and all the Christian values come through.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's at the end of the day, did Jesus lay down his life, become the lamb for everybody? Yes. Does he become the lion in the sense of killing sin and death? Sure, that's part of the theology. But the way that the ethics around how you treat people and deal with people is more towards one than the other. The very last line in Wild at Heart is, God is a warrior God and every man is made in his image. And that idea of God being a warrior God, like Mark Driscoll somewhere just woke up in his sleep and he's like, yes, he is. And I got really excited. But
don't bring him down upon us. What have you done?
But I can't always reconcile that with who Jesus was.
Yeah, no, I've turned down invitations to men's retreat because I heard one of the highlights was we're gonna shoot a bunch of guns, and I said I'm good. I think I'll just stay home. Thanks. And I'm dead serious.
I
It's just
have
not my thing.
I have a feeling that the ante for getting men interested has only been upped in a certain way. You
Yeah.
know, like we got to go do this basic training and shoot guns, and heck, on some of those angertainment channels, their number one sponsor are people who sell survival kits.
I saw one today. It was a YouTube ad. I was watching some music video. I was watching some music theory video, and it was before it. It was this survival kit of
Right.
everything's going to collapse in 2024. Be ready.
Right.
Like, oh,
Right.
I'm not. Crap.
Oh, you're a terrible husband.
I've been spending all my time on podcasts. No.
Well, that's it for today. Let's go, Caleb. We got work to do.
These will help us survive. I'm sure of it. You mentioned the Memorial Day and kind of that freedom aspect. Like we saw it at church this week. And again, I absolutely love my church, but like this is the second time at our church that they've kind of brought up this idea of freedom and sacrifice. And I'm all for them recognizing Memorial Day weekend out at a church service, but a couple times now it's kind of mingled a little too closely. There's been too much of a crossover between soldier sacrifice and Jesus sacrifice and American freedom and biblical freedom, and that's always made me it puts my red flags up. It doesn't make me run for the door. It doesn't make me go, oh my gosh, this is how could you say something like this? Mm-hmm. But it makes my red flags go up. And it was actually in a prayer 2 years ago when we were visiting the church where it was this idea that this soldier's sacrifice was somehow equivalent to Jesus. Like it was made to sound equal to Jesus's sacrifice. And that really did like have me go like, oh, I really struggle with that. So is that another aspect that you've seen kind of as you've journeyed through this kind of the political landscape of the last 25 years? That's a broad question. Good luck with that.
Wow, we're really, this one's going to go long, isn't it?
Yeah, it's over. No. It's going to take me weeks to edit this.
That's right. So first, I'm going to give a little preview to anybody who's still listening because this is going to get crazy.
Thanks, Mom. Actually, she told me this weekend she's behind. So thanks, Bethany. She's up to date.
Jeez, Caleb's mom, get with the program. But so we are going to record another episode that will come out on July 4th about freedom being an idol. And yeah, I say that phrase to be a little bit of, to catch people's interest, right? To be sensational. Yeah. But I mean, I have gone to churches on July 4th that are not mine, and every song, it's like the worship team decided, okay, what are our songs going to be this week? Well, let's Control F and search for the word freedom and then just sing it. Yeah. Because it'll click that part of people's brains. I'm being very, very cynical in that comment. I apologize a little bit. But it's biblical freedom and American freedom are very different. Yeah. And so I don't want to get too into it because we're going to talk about that at a different time. But absolutely, the soldier sacrificing for our freedom is tremendous. I don't know if I'd be able to do something like that. Maybe, but like tremendous sacrifice for a human, probably the biggest sacrifice you can make. One of the stakes with Jesus, I would argue, are higher. Yeah. And so that's kind of where you have to be pretty careful. And I think, especially the way churches are in America these days, it's easy to slap both together and be like, look, this landed in the service, great. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of theology around it. So maybe we can dive into some of that theology when we do the freedom bit. The freedom episode next week.
Good promo. Nice work.
Ooh, it is.
You're getting better at this.
Segment that out and then throw the promo on the.
No, it fits right here. That'd be way too much editing.
You're super lazy. So yeah, I mean, now when you look at where we're at today, and again, one of our guests that we'll talk to that is a generation behind us did talk about what happened in 2016, and that was so formative for so many people. And You and I, before this, for a few days, we've been texting like we don't want it to be all about deconstruction, and that's such a flashy word for multiple different ways of dealing with faith. But I would argue 2016 election of Donald Trump was a trigger, I use that word lightly, for deconstruction for a lot of people, for the very reason that the party of family values is now supporting and will continue to support, because the support is still there, somebody who used very vulgar language about sexual assault on a video that came out right before the election, and now is in court and has, for all intents and purposes, proven to have slept with a porn star while his wife was raising their child.
Yeah.
And also has been convicted of sexual assault. But those people are still behind them. 81% in 2016. It was still over 80% in 2020. In 2024, what's it going to be? And yeah, do I get emotional about that? Sure. But at the end of the day, it's like, why? Why did the party we grew up with, who had a moral stance on something that was so clear, cut and dry, end up fully supporting somebody who disengages, has completely disengaged from, that lifestyle, a Christian lifestyle.
Yep.
What always is bonkers to me is George Bush, Barack Obama, Joe Biden all went to church, all go to church.
Yeah.
Trump just doesn't.
Yeah.
And all these things are not just for a lot of people our age, but a lot of people a generation younger than us. They look back on it and they're like, that does not compute.
And I think the level of intensity also makes it hard. And the example I have is that it's not just that, you threw out the stat like 80% of evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. But I was at a church event. So this is a church sanctioned event. And somehow politics came up. And I said, I just can't vote for him with a good conscience. I just was like, I just can't do it. And at a church event, I was called stupid to my face. You're stupid for having that opinion. And not one person around me stood up and said, hey, now, we all know Caleb pretty well. And he's not just a flippant, go with the flow person. Like, Caleb does think these things through. I think that is even added to the triggering nature of it for so many people, is that it's not just a support, but it's the intensity of that support has become so unique to a meshing of politics and church experience that I just don't think we ever saw before that. Or maybe we did and we missed it, but I don't feel like I saw it before that.
Yeah, you're 100% right about that. Look, I remember having conversations with my family members when Jon Stewart was retiring from The Daily Show, and it was basically like good riddance, and kind of had some conversations about that. And I think between George Bush being, kind of a bumbling, silly fool, he's always had a lot of gaffes, and you go from that to Obama, who was a very sharp man and, really very well educated, very well spoken, and could be pretty snarky at times because he would call out the other people on their BS. A lot of people who were conservative at the time and still are, they just felt like embarrassed, or they didn't have somebody standing up for them, or they felt like they were being played the fool and being a target or being a victim of a lot of the butt end of jokes, policy making, that sort of thing. Trump comes along and says, you give me the power, I will fight for you. And again, we go back to that power dynamic of, combining faith and secular government. It never ends well, And so the fighting, defending, I'll give you what you want as long as you let me have free reign. That's where the power dynamic has been so clear to me and how dangerous it is. And it's the rhetoric's only become more and more dangerous over time. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the biggest problem I have with it is Trump's not the only, and his supporters are not the only ones perpetrating this. Both sides certainly are, but I think the volume's turned up to 11 on his side. There's so much us versus them mentality And that is the most, almost the most anti-biblical thing I can think of. Is we're against you, you're the enemy, and you're stupid.
Yeah.
And we're part of different camps. You know, my this weekend, our pastor preached on unity from Romans, and you know, one of the titles was unity, not uniformity. So you don't always have to be the same. And I was like, oh, that's a good little quip. But unity is something that is, both sides preach like, oh, we'll bring the country back together, but they have really no intention of doing so. And that makes me sad. You know, when I'm growing up in a family where all I hear is Democrats are evil, they're stupid, they have no morals, they're amoral, and they can say that in general about them, but then when you have to have someone who is that in your presence, it's such a diversive dynamic and way of speaking, and ultimately just not Christ-like.
Yeah.
And that's what really drives me crazy about all this politics right now, and how can we be different? And maybe that's a good place to end, is where do we go from here? How do we get away from that us versus mentality? How do we get to that point of unity? Maybe some of that is pulling back our expectation that government is going to save us. It's going to, you know, be the resolution, so on and so forth. Because I think, you know, both sides think that. Because both sides think if the other person gets elected, the world is immediately going to start on fire. But like moving forward, like how do you think we get away from the us versus them versus the enemy versus, you know, the other person is evil discussion?
I think it's come up a couple times. For me, what my tagline has started to be, you nailed it. Like, just because somebody disagrees with you doesn't mean they're evil. It doesn't mean they're an idiot. Because I fell into that trap real hard. I really was struggling in 2020 specifically to not have that mentality. One of the reasons I like my current church is they're trying to have a mentality of, we really want to be a church where people can disagree. Now, it's still a mostly conservative church, but you know, they're trying to kind of have that we're not going to preach stuff from the pulpit that is like, we're going to try and just have topics from the pulpit, because some of those, like who you should vote for, how you should think about politics, how you should, you know, complementarian versus egalitarian, and I always say that wrong, like how your household should run. Like, those are topics that, yes, the church has a stance on, but we also understand that though there's a variety of opinions, and let's let those conversations happen in small group where people are actually face to face, and you actually have to engage with somebody in the room, and you can't just make these broad statements. Because I've said it for a while. I think the only way that you get like revival of the church in America, in my opinion, and this is going to be a wild and crazy statement, so be forewarned.
I'm sitting down, don't worry.
Yeah, I think it's people start to look at Christians who can engage with somebody who they don't agree with, and there's just none of that talk of you're evil and you're an idiot, and we just that language goes away, because that's become such a cultural war language that I think if the church actually did that, and you actually had churches that had really wide open doors, and we're just saying, yep, come on in. This isn't about uniformity. That's a great word. You know, this isn't about uniformity. This is about being together and really loving people that I may disagree with. I think the culture potentially would start to look at the church and go, okay, what's going on here? Like, this is weird. What you guys are doing is weird. And I am tired of fighting. I am tired of being upset. And so that's been kind of my thought process for a while. I don't know if I see it happening. I don't know, but like that's been my like goal for myself, and then trying to say that to as many people as I can. Like, I think that's a way to change the culture, is to actually change the culture by just not being mad at each other.
Maybe having a little bit of grace.
Right.
And you're going back to our conversation before about biblical ethics, like maybe setting down some of your, you know, convictions or whatever to meet the person where they're at. Easier said than done, but it takes intentionality.
Yeah.
And I don't think either of us are saying don't be engaged in politics, right?
No.
Like, that's not the case. we would absolutely tell people to go vote, you know? Like,
Yep.
it's a question of, like, where's the line? Like, how far, how much is too much? How far is too far? You know, you have no lines and you start to have the Christian nationalism theme because we want our ethics imposed on everyone else because we believe we have the best one. And then you get too far the other way and it's just like, I'm just not going to engage and get super cynical. You know, like there's certainly a level of, no, do your due diligence and vote on your convictions, but those convictions have to encompass some of these things that you've talked about for decades of being a party of these certain values. And I would say too, like, to your point of people taking note, like the world is watching.
Yeah.
And if an evangelicals, as we grew up in the 90s as evangelicals, if the point is to win people over to quote our side, have them cross the line of faith, believe in God, trust Jesus, start, you know, coming to church, following him, all those things. If that's the point, you have to understand the world is watching.
Yeah.
And so when 81% of evangelicals say my values don't matter anymore, just whatever power and protection I can get does, that is a very powerful message.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not saying you necessarily shouldn't vote on that conviction, but be very mindful that when these two, faith and politics, start crossing very heavily, you get people who are not believers who rightfully so say, why aren't you looking out for the least of these? And that's what always gets me is, yeah, if we have disunity, we're not engaged with each other as lovingly as we should. I get that. But if we want to stand here and tell people they're going to hell because they're a bad person, or sorry, they're going to hell because they haven't crossed the line of faith yet, which has to do with their ethics and their moral decisions, then also saying, you know what, we're not going to care for the little guy. My politics are not going to, I don't want to get too salty here. I've got not that much time left. My politics are not going to care for a baby after they're born. At that point, they're on their own. Yeah. Why would they want to come engage with us?
Yeah.
Because we have a good band and because we'll tell you that we love you? No. So many people for that message, they see right through it.
Yeah.
And I'm so sensitive to that experience, maybe overly so.
Yeah.
But I'd rather err on their side than mine.
And it's said with an arrogance sometimes too, that, you know, the verse is true. Like Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I think so many Christians have turned that verse into, well, I follow Jesus. He's the way, the truth, and the life. Therefore, everything I believe and know is the truth. And then when I have these convictions, I'm 100% right about everything. And it makes it, the arrogance in which way we say it just makes it so murky waters. It just messes up the message so much when we say those sorts of things. But yeah,
I came in with a hot political statement at the end, and you came in with a hot theological statement at the end. That is a very good place to leave this.
See you next week. No.
It's like Seth Meyers on Corrections. See me next week. Shout out Corrections. If you know, you know.
I don't know. I'm so uncultured.
Oh, dude, you got a good about 102 episodes of YouTube videos to watch.
I got a lot of records to listen to.
Nope, this is a better priority. You know, this has been a little more of a sober conversation. It's obviously a serious conversation. And, you know, next week we'll continue the conversation about freedom and what that means. And look, we live in some crazy times. I think everybody probably says that. There's a lot of people right now who are just feeling the dread of whatever happens, you know, in November. And I think from a Christian perspective, yes, it's very difficult to do. Stay engaged, but don't communicate the message that like the world is going to explode if your choice doesn't get chosen or elected. You know, there's Five Iron was such a good band talking about hope. Like, if you truly have, you know, I don't want to generalize too much, but like if there's really that hope and something beyond this world, then you can't get too upset one way or the other. I'm not saying you shouldn't be engaged or enthusiastic or because it is important. And, we're two white dudes, cis dudes here, white cis dudes talking about this. This election might have tremendous consequences for people who aren't in our position. And that's the other thing to think about we didn't really get into is like, yeah, maybe I vote a certain way. How does that affect other people? That sort of thing. And again, how does it benefit the least of these? And drawing that line of can this ethic be imposed or used in a government setting, can it not? That's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what we're all trying to do, but we've gotten pretty antagonistic about it.
And I would say to close this out, even in this conversation, I think you and I are doing our best to. I don't think either of us think we've got it all figured out, and there's nothing we're wrong on. There's that, like, I think both of us are. This is kind of our observations and our feelings. Like, yeah, we believe what we're saying is right because that's what you do. Like, you think through things. I mean, I think that's the hard line to walk. Like, I believe what I believe because I thought it through. And I landed here because of the rationale, but I think both of us are trying to. Maybe this is just more of a line to the listener. Like, we are trying to be fairly. I think both of us have taken on this conversation fairly humbly, which I know is always a real good thing. People tell you how humble they are, but we have we're not taking this lightly. Like, we were texting yesterday about wanting to talk about this, but we don't want to just be well, if you did this, you're wrong and you're dumb. Like, we're really trying to walk through this and kind of just state observations we've seen and where we're kind of what has been troubling to us and what's been potentially exciting. I don't think there's been a lot of super exciting stuff here.
Excitement's a pretty strong word there.
Yeah.
But yeah, and maybe people have a position where they still feel like they can't change that or they can't talk about it. They're in a church setting like maybe you were, they get talked down, or a family setting like I've been in the past where I feel like I can't say very much without being yelled at. And it's like, man, that's not where Jesus wants us to be, And it's really, really sad that we've gotten to that point. So I've had to do it myself. I think it's a very healthy thing to do. Like, look at the diet of media you take in, and make sure it's not like overly cynical, overly critical. Make sure it's factual and make sure it's true, because I guess you can choose whatever set of facts you want to believe in these days, but try and get it as true and to the facts as possible. But don't have that mentality of the other side as the enemy. That's just that's what kind of drives this whole thing, and it's a really sad place to be. And I think if I think both sides would say Jesus is mad about you being pro-life, pro-choice, whatever. Ultimately, I think he's the most pissed off that we just can't, stay united on some of these things.
Yeah. Or just can't give people the grace that he's given us and can't give people the mercy that he's given us. Like, that's what we're called to do above all else.
Well, Caleb, thanks for hanging in here with me. This is a very, very fun conversation. But next week we'll talk about freedom, and then maybe we'll have something for final week 4 of this politics series, and hopefully after that people still want to listen to this podcast, because
I did think about that.
We don't have many to lose, so please hang around.
Yeah, and I'll say it at the end. Spread the word.
All right, thanks, Caleb.
All right.
Talk soon.
Yep, see ya.
See ya.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. We hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you thought about this show or any of our other shows. We know the discussion about politics can be a triggering one. It can be an emotional one. We know there's the potential that we've said some things that you really disagree with on the show. Maybe we said some stuff that really resonated with you and you feel like you could connect with. But we do know that this can be a very emotional, hot button topic. So if you want to talk with us further, please reach out to the show. You can find us on Twitter at SurvivedYG. You can also email the show at isurvivedyouthgroup@gmail.com. If you're interested in being on the show, email us or find us on Twitter. We'd love to talk with you further. Maybe you are interested in talking about this topic a little further. Maybe there are some things you'd like to question or challenge, or just some things that resonated with you enough that you would want to share as well. If we feel like we can have an engaging and a respectful conversation, we'd love to keep the conversation going just to dive into this sort of topic a little further. We know it can be difficult to engage with people about politics, but we'd love to try. Please subscribe and share the podcast if you're so inclined. Leave a rating or review. If you enjoy this show, you might also enjoy the other podcast I do. It's a music podcast called the Album Anniversary Podcast. Over the last couple of years, I've researched and documented the release date of thousands of albums. Throughout the week, I post about them on social media. We have had a couple different formats on the show, but it's a chance for me to talk with someone else, usually, about the music that I've documented on my calendar. Once again, it's called the Album Anniversary Podcast. The music at the beginning and the end of this show is the instrumental version of the song Positive Charge by the artist Dread Pirate Roberts. Thanks again, and we will talk to you soon. All right, let me hit record.
Right.
Am I?
You already hit
I'm
record.
already recording. Good job, me. I'm good at this job. Okay.
What's where I'm thinking of, Caleb? You don't know.
I
Sorry,
I
count me
barely
in.
know where I am.